All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I believe this is episode 68. We are reading Angela Y. Davis's Women, Race, and Class, and we are on chapter 6, the top of page 99. Millions of black people, and especially the women, were convinced that emancipation was, quote, the coming of the Lord, end quote. Quote, this was the fulfillment of prophecy and legend. It was the golden dawn after chains of 1,000 years. It was everything miraculous and perfect and promising. There was joy in the South. It rose like perfume, like a prayer. Men stood quivering. Slim, dark girls, wild and beautiful with wrinkled hair, wept silently. Young women, black, tawny, white and golden, lifted shivering hands, and old and broken mothers, black and gray, raised great voices and shouted to God across the fields and up to the rocks in the mountains. A great song arose, the loveliest thing born this side of the seas. It was a new song, and its deep and plaintive beauty, its great cadences and wild appeal wailed, throbbed and thundered on the world's ears with a message seldom voiced by man. It swelled and blossomed like incense, improvised and born anew out of an age-long past and weaving into its texture the old and new melodies in word and in thought, end quote. Black people were hardly celebrating the abstract principles of freedom when they hailed the advent of emancipation. As that, quote, great human sob shrieked in the wind and tossed its tears upon the sea, free, 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 end quote, black people were not giving vent to religious frenzy. They knew exactly what they wanted. The women and the men alike wanted land, they wanted the ballot, and, quote, they were consumed with desire for schools, end quote. Like the young slave child Frederick Douglass, many of the 4 million people who celebrated emancipation had long since realized that, quote, knowledge unfits a child to be a slave, end quote. And like Douglass's master, the former slaveholders realized that, quote, if you give a nigger an inch, he will take an L. Learning will spoil the best nigger in the world, end quote. Master Hugh's proscription notwithstanding, Frederick Douglass secretly continued his pursuit of knowledge. Soon he could write all the words from Webster's spelling book, further perfecting his skill by examining the family Bible and other books in the clandestinity of the night. Of course, Frederick Douglass was an exceptional human being who became a brilliant thinker, writer, and orator. But his desire for knowledge was by no means exceptional among black people, who had always manifested a deep-seated urge to acquire knowledge. Great numbers of slaves also wanted to be, quote, unfit, end quote, for the harrowing existence they led. A former slave interviewed during the 1930s, Jenny Proctor, recalled the Webster spelling book which she and her friends had surreptitiously studied. Quote, none of us was loath to see a book or try to learn. They say we get smarter than they was if we learn anything. But we slips around and gets hold of that Webster's old blueback speller, and we hides it till way in the night, and then we lights a little pine torch and studies that spelling book. We learn it too. I can read some now and write a little too, end quote. Black people learned that emancipation's, quote, 40 acres and a mule, end quote, was a malicious rumor. They would have to fight for land. They would have to fight for political power. And after centuries of educational deprivation, they would zealously assert their right to satisfy their profound craving for learning. Thus, like their sisters and brothers all over the South, the newly liberated black people of Memphis assembled and resolved that education was their first priority. Okay, I think one of the things that's important to point out from the passage that we were just reading is the historical context that education and specifically reading and writing has had with black people in this country and with people who were enslaved in this country. And it has always had a connotation of negativity that has came with it. It was people who would be killed and who would have corporal punishment enacted upon them because they educated themselves and informed themselves and learned how to read and learned how to write. And I think that one of the things that we have pointed out before is how and this was in a previous episode, not necessarily in this reading, but how generational trauma works and how something can be done to your great grandmother and you can still have psychological effects from that generations down the line. And so I think that is something that has to also be pointed out about education in this country and about reading and writing in this country. And that is that there was a damning psychological effect upon Black people when it came to reading and writing and learning. But I also think that one of the things that's important to point out is that the slave masters understood that was the key to these people being able to break out of the subjugation and marginalization and to be able to challenge the oppressive systems in a society that existed. It was through reading and writing and learning and being able to articulate why these things were unjust and why these things were wrong. And so I think that we have to always put that at the forefront of our activism, and always have to put that at the forefront of the programs that we are rolling out and the organizations that we are rolling out. Put education and information and literacy and reading and writing and articulating at the forefront of those things, because we know that the power that those things have. And so here, let's continue reading though. Black people learned that emancipations... Oh, we already read through that. Sorry about that. Okay, let's try it one more time. Black people learned that emancipation's, quote, 40 acres and a mule, end quote, was a malicious rumor. They would have to fight for land. They would have to fight for political power. And after centuries of educational deprivation, they would zealously assert their right to satisfy their profound craving for learning. Thus, like their sisters and brothers all over the South, the newly liberated Black people of Memphis assembled and resolved that education was their first priority. On the first anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, they urged the Northern teachers to make haste and, quote, to bring their tents with them, ready for erection in the field, by the roadside, or in the fort, and not to wait for magnificent houses to be erected in time of war, end quote. The mystifying powers of racism often emanate from its irrational, topsy-turvy logic. According to the prevailing ideology, Black people were allegedly incapable of intellectual advancement. After all, they have been chattel, naturally inferior as compared to the white epitomes of humankind. But if they really were biologically inferior, they would have manifested neither the desire nor the capability to acquire knowledge. Ergo, no prohibition of learning would have been necessary. In reality, of course, Black people had always exhibited a furious impatience as regards to the acquisition of education. The yearning for knowledge had always been there. As early as 1787, Black people petitioned the state of Massachusetts for the right to attend Boston's free schools. After the petition was rejected, Prince Hall, who was the leader of this initiative, established a school in his own home. Perhaps the most stunning illustration of this early demand for education was the work of an African-born woman who was a former slave. In 1793, Lucy Terry Prince boldly demanded an audience before the trustees of the newly established Williams College for Men, who had refused to admit her son into the school. Unfortunately, the racist prejudices were so strong that Lucy Prince's logic and eloquence could not sway the trustees of this Vermont institution. Yet she aggressively defended her people's desire for, and right to, education. 2 years later, Lucy Terry Prince successfully defended a land claim before the highest court of the land, and according to surviving records, she remains the first woman to have addressed the Supreme Court of the United States. 1793 was also the year an ex-slave woman who had purchased her freedom established a school in the city of New York, which was known as Katie Ferguson School for the Poor. Her pupils, whom she recruited from the poorhouse, were both Black and white, 28 and 20 respectively, and were quite possibly both boys and girls. 40 years later, the young white teacher Prudence Candle steadfastly defended Black girls' right to attend her Canterbury, Connecticut school. Crandall persistently taught her Black pupils until she was dragged off to jail for refusing to shut down her school. Margaret Douglas was another white woman who was imprisoned in Norfolk, Virginia, for operating a school for Black children. And I think one of the things I would like to point out there is there has been a commonality in multiple books that we've read, and has also been a commonality within this book, is the tactic of imprisonment being used when someone is in engaging in acts that upset the status quo of the society. And so in the time which we're reading about here, educating and teaching black youth, teaching women was something that was going against the status quo of the society. And so a tactic that is used is imprisonment. Often I point out how the police department is not here to keep people safe. It's here to uphold status quo. And that's one of the things that we see enacted in that passage there. The most outstanding examples of white women's sisterly solidarity with black women are associated with black people's historical struggle for education. Like Prudence Crandall and Margaret Douglas, Myrtilla Minor literally risked her life as she sought to impart knowledge to young black women. In 1851, when she initiated her project to establish a black teachers' college in Washington, D.C., she had already instructed black children in Mississippi, a state where education for blacks was a criminal offense. After Myrtilla Minor's death, Frederick Douglass described his own incredulousness when she first announced her plans to him. During their first meeting, he wondered about her seriousness in the beginning, but then he realized that, quote, the fire of enthusiasm lighted in her eye and that the true martyr spirit flamed in her soul. My feelings were those of mingled joy and sadness. Here I thought is another enterprise, wild, dangerous, desperate, and impracticable, and destined only to bring failure and suffering. Yet I was deeply moved with admiration by the heroic purpose of the delicate and fragile person who stood, or rather moved to and fro, before me. End quote. It was not long before Douglass recognized that none of the warnings he issued to her, and not even the stories of the attacks of Prudence Crandall and Margaret Douglass, could shake her determination to found a college for black women teachers. Quote, to me, the proposition was reckless almost to the point of madness. In my fancy, I saw this fragile little woman harassed by the law, insulted in the street, a victim of slaveholding malice, and possibly beaten down by the mob. End quote. In Frederick Douglass's opinion, relatively few white people outside the anti-slavery activists would sympathize with Myrtilla Minor's cause and support her against the mob. This was a period, he argued, of diminishing solidarity with black people. Moreover, quote, the District of Columbia was the very citadel of slavery, the place most watched and guarded by the slave power and where humane tendencies were more speedily detected and sternly opposed. End quote. End quote. In retrospect, however, Douglass confessed that he did not really understand the depth of this white woman's individual courage. Despite the grave risks, Myrtilla Minor opened her school in the fall of 1851, and within a few months her initial 6 students had grown to 40. She taught her black students passionately over the next 8 years, simultaneously raising money and urging congressmen to support her efforts. She even acted as a mother to the orphan girls whom she brought into her home so that they might attend the school. As Myrtilla Minor struggled to teach and as her pupils struggled to learn, they all fought evictions, arson attempts, and the other misdeeds of racist stone-throwing mobs. They were supported by the young women's families and abolitionists such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, who donated a portion of the royalties she received from the sale of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Myrtilla Minor may have been, quote, frail, end quote, as Frederick Douglass observed, but she was definitely formidable and was always able, at lesson time, to discover the eye of that racist storm. Early one morning, however, she was abruptly awakened by the odor of smoke and raging flames, which soon consumed her schoolhouse. Although her school was destroyed, the inspiration she provided lived on, and eventually Minor's Teachers College became a part of the District of Columbia public educational system. Quote, I never passed the Minor Normal School for Colored Girls, end quote, so Frederick Douglass confessed in 1883. Quote, without a feeling of self-reproach that I could have said aught to quench the zeal, shake the faith, and quell the courage of the noble woman by whom it was founded and whose name it bears, end quote. Okay, and I think that one of the things that, again, is a commonality throughout this book is the solidarity that was in existence between specifically white women and black people during this time because of the overt and covert similarities between the subjugation and marginalization and oppression and exploitation that they were experiencing and dealing with. And I think for this specific chapter just shows the the power of knowledge and the power of education and the fear that it puts into people who want to uphold the status quo of ignorance that exists in our society. And so I'm gonna end this specific segment, but we are gonna finish this chapter up on this episode. We got about 2 to 3 pages left. So I'm gonna end this segment here and then we'll pick back up.